All right, welcome everybody. Today is October 19th, 2022. It is 6 p.m. This is the Upper Dublin School District Finance Committee, and I will call the meeting to order. We have a full complement of committee members. Welcome, Alina, to your first in-person meeting. And do we have the entire rest of the board here tonight? That's great. Okay. So let's jump right in. Any announcements?
There are no announcements.
Right, we do have minutes from our September 14th meeting. Members of the committee have had an opportunity to review those. Everyone prepared to approve the minutes from September? Okay. Those are approved and will appear on the legislative agenda as an informational item. And we'll jump right into reports and recommendations, starting with the transportation facility feasibility study.
Yes, thank you. And we do have a bunch of stuff to get through tonight. So the first item that I want to cover this evening, so if you remember back to our September Finance Committee meeting, we gave an update. I gave an update on the current transportation facility, and we discussed the desire to continue to evaluate the need for a transportation facility to both meet the needs of our current department, we went through all those needs, and develop a facility that we talked about being future ready for EV technology, to be positioned to take advantage of this technology when it's ready. We talked a little bit about the current state of the technology, the cost of the technology just not being ready for us right now. So when I say future ready, what we're really looking at is a 3 to 5 year time horizon to start to get that in place. And in order to do that, we need a facility to be prepared for that. I say 3 to 5 years because 2 years, we believe, again, as we talk about our proposed facility, we have an estimate that the facility itself will take about 2 years to get through planning and built, plus, again, time for the technology to continue to improve and costs to be more manageable. I continue to recommend district-owned land for this facility as it's the most cost-effective option. We talked about that last month. And the two sites that we talked about, district-owned land, were the 309 site, which we already have the feasibility study on and kind of a plan for. And then last month we talked about the district office site, which is on Edwards Field. And one of the things that the committee requested was a proposal to look at doing a feasibility study on the Edwards Field or the district office site to have a comparison for the 309 site. So we have a proposal tonight that you have in front of you attached on the agenda. We went to our professional ICS. ICS is doing a good bit of work for the district right now, both on our insurance claim and with CMTA on our Giza project on the Fort Washington Elementary School. So we feel ICS is best positioned to complete this feasibility study for us. We've been working collaboratively with them. They also did a magnificent job doing our facility condition assessment. So the proposal that they provided has a total cost of $12,000, which is very much in line with what we expected. It was in line with our last feasibility study was $15,000 that Dewey Engineering did for us. The time frame that they estimate to complete the study would be 10 to 12 weeks from the time that the board approves the feasibility study. And then obviously at the end of that study, we would continuously meet with ICS throughout the project to understand their findings, but it would conclude with a presentation similar to what we did with the last feasibility study to the Finance Committee to report the findings, which would likely be at the January or February committee meeting. So with that, I will certainly stop and take questions if you have any specific questions about the items in the feasibility study. I do know that Mr. Slaughter is here tonight, and he can certainly help answer if there's any questions that I am not able to answer.
All right, any questions from the committee? All right, I have one. Toward the end of the document, there's a list of items which are specifically excluded from the scope of work, and that includes historical reports. And I just want to make sure that this study is going to cover whether we are actually allowed to build this kind of facility on that property, because that property is on the historic register. It's a part of 5H. If that means, we're not going to go back and tell you about the history of the site, that's fine. But if it means we're not going to look into the historical commission's.
You able to answer that, Bill?
Certainly. So we would pull the deed from the county, research any restrictions that are involved with the deed, but that caveat was for doing a historical investigation in the ground itself. So we would research it from the county standpoint and the township standpoint to make sure there's no hidden items that would preclude us from doing that site there.
Thanks, Bill, for that clarification. Any other questions or comments, Titia?
With the traffic, will you just look at current traffic, or are you also considering other access roads?
So with the traffic, we're going to analyze what the best entrance and exit strategies would be for the roads and the location based on what the grounds have there as far as wetlands and other things like that. But not a full traffic study. We would just do vehicle counts and anticipation of where we would enter and exit the property.
Yeah, there's a property behind Temple Ambler. Would you also look at access to that property? Because
would
there's
look
a
at-
road
we would-
running around the back.
We would look at any access point. We're aware of the neighborhood behind that area and Templar Ambler campus and the church property that's back there as well. So,
All right, thanks.
Anyone else? Or from the rest of the board? So, members of the committee, do you want to move this one forward to the legislative meeting? Yes, okay. So we will move that forward and move on to bus interior cameras.
Mr. Robbins is actually going to come up and go through this item.
How you doing? So tonight we're presenting getting interior cameras for the remainder of our bus fleet that currently is not equipped with ProVision cameras. Vehicles purchased over the last 4 years have been purchased with camera systems in them. The original camera systems that were purchased prior to that are insufficient, don't work. And the cameras the first 2 years that I was here aren't of the quality that we would like, that give us the best vantage point on our buses. So we are right now proposing to get 31 camera systems and 28 DVRs that will equip the remainder of our fleet. Doing so now is probably best because we, through our partnership with Assist Services, have saved a good amount of money from what we budgeted, so we could use those funds to put these cameras in rather than wait, because it would take us probably another 7 years in order to equip all of our buses with these camera systems. I know one question that might come up is why only 28 DVRs but 31 camera systems? That's because those DVRs were already purchased pre-COVID when we bought ProVision stop arm cameras for some of our buses to pilot those. So it would use the same DVR system. So.
Mr. Robbins, if I can just, you made a point about we're saving money with assist services. So the board remembers, as a result of the tornado, we had a significant number of kids that were transporting that were deemed homeless under McKinney-Vento. And when we constructed our budget, we were using the intermediate unit transportation department. Given the number of students that we needed to transport, we all know that there's a shortage of drivers. And so that's why we turn to assist services to be able to successfully get kids to and from school and where they needed to be. And so when we say we're saving money, I don't want anyone at home or listening thinking that we're cheaping out on services. It's just that assist services is more economical than the IU rates that we were paying for transportation.
Questions from the committee?
When you have these cameras and all this footage, do you have people to look at it, or what's the mechanism for people to look at it?
So we look at it when complaints come in, whether there's an incident on the bus. I go out, I pull the SD card, and then I can go to either whatever time it's reported that an incident occurred, or I can go through all the footage and look to see when it occurred.
And you have storage capacity for all that data for a certain period
So
of time?
the SD card, I've seen as much as 30 days worth of footage on there.
And I'm seeing here that if the order is received after October 31st, then there is an additional cost.
Correct.
So this timeline this is a pretty tight timeline.
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
Well, presumably, so if we move this ahead and approve it next Monday, that's plenty of time before October 31st to get this executed, right? Any other questions? Jenna?
Can you explain a little bit more what, are these going to be, do we already have stop arm cameras? You said for some of them, so is this going to be stop arm and interior or just interior?
It would just be interior.
Okay.
As we continue, just a brief point, as we continue to refine our safety and security practices, this purchase, in the opinion of the administration, makes sense. One of the challenges I see that every district has is if we didn't have to bus kids to and from school, we'd have a lot fewer discipline problems. But the footage that we get from these cameras, in many cases, allows us to reduce the amount of time that we have to spend investigating a disciplinary issue. So, for all of those reasons, we're recommending.
Yeah, absolutely. It has helped over the last few years that we've had this system in our buses, or the last school year and a half since we've had them in our buses, and it really does make things a lot easier for us when a disciplinary problem occurs on the buses that are equipped. So equipping all the buses will make things a lot easier.
So Chris, this is one camera per bus that doesn't have one already, have a modern camera already? Is that
No,
right?
so it's actually two. It's
Okay.
a front and a rear camera
Okay.
for each bus.
And just to make sure, to clarify, we're not moving ahead with I know this is a separate issue, but we're not moving ahead with stop arm cameras that we piloted a while back.
Not at this time.
We continue to use the three that we have?
So when the 5 buses that we purchased last year, when they come in, we will be up to 13 buses equipped with stop arm cameras.
Okay, so we'll just continue to do that on the replacement cycle rather than all at once like this?
Yes, and we'll still continue to look at other options that are out there in regards to stop arm cameras as well.
Okay, and I just want to, I'm pretty sure this is the case, but we do have board policy governing the data from these cameras and who can look at it and when it can be looked at and that kind of thing. We already have that because we have some cameras that will have cameras on all the bus. Doesn't imply any need to change any of that, right? Any other comments or questions from committee or the board? Okay, we'll move that forward. Yes. Yeah. All right, thank you. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
On to the SRMS update, Bob.
The big project going on right now is still the moving of the dirt, the excess dirt that we have to get off site. There's a delay over the past week. The contractor who's accepting the dirt needed to change phasing and move some of their erosion and sediment control measures around. So it's taking them about a week to do that. So hopefully we'll be starting up again pretty soon, moving the dirt. They're probably about 65% of the way through. They're probably running about 250 to 300 dump trucks a day through off the site and removing the soil. So that continues to go well. The retaining wall is being built. That they're probably up about 45% on the retaining wall structure. You start to see, if you come into the site, you can start to see the curve of the wall. It still needs to extend and still has some height to go on it as well. As people also have seen, site lighting is up. We were just working through some control issues, getting them to run on the right proper schedules and run on the photocell. So that is in the works, and we'll update everybody as soon as we do get control over that. Other than that, the systems on the building, everything's working well. We're working through punch list items. Very few bugs that we've had to work through so far in the building, which is good to see.
All right, thanks. Anything to call our attention to on the budget, Andy?
Nothing specifically in the details. I will say that we just received a draft from Dewey for a large change order, which are all documented on the budget. So in the budget packet under project budget risk areas, Dewey did talk to us about that 2 months ago. Those numbers should be finalized by the time we get to next month's meeting, and I would expect to have Dewey back just to walk us through the final numbers and kind of the final outcome of those that change order. So nothing specifically, but we'll see more on that next month.
All right, comments or questions? All right, question about, so we have lighting and we'll soon have control over the lighting. That was, I think, sort of the last thing before we could open the building to community use. We had needed a parking lot and lighting. So were we there?
This is my favorite topic, although I thought the question was going to come from Dr. Levinowitz.
He didn't raise his hand, so
We will likely be bringing the building online for outside groups at the start of the second semester, so this winter.
Okay. One of the questions that goes with that is we do have board policy governing, well, it's actually in the AR, governing rates for offsite usage, and because this is an all-new building with different facilities, we need to revisit that before we...
We're going to revisit that as an executive leadership team along with Bob, so that we can have that well done in advance of bringing the building online for outside groups.
Yep, Titia?
At what point is the lead punch list, or is the list ready for actual certification?
On the lead side, they're still going through the documentation, the building, and that could take up to a year after we open for lead.
As I recall, the entire project has to be complete, including the grounds, before we can even start that final process, right?
Yes.
Yeah. All right, anybody else? Art?
I spent some time yesterday with the community tour at Sandy Run, and I thought it was, just wanted to give a thank you to Dr. Ortiz, and who welcomed all the visitors, and we were quite busy again last night, and Rob was in the planetarium doing his thing, and I just, every time you walk into that planetarium and see what they can do in there, it's really incredible. And I would assume that in January or February, we'll be starting to look at possible events in the evening in the planetarium also. So that would cover the 2 gyms, the auditorium, the planetarium, and whatever else.
Some possible use of collaboration space for small clubs and whatnot.
Oh, yeah.
Between the 2 evenings, last Tuesday night and last evening, approximately 400 people toured the building, so it was good. Dr. Ortiz had students stationed throughout the main floor, so folks were able to meander around and then learn about the different spaces throughout the building.
Yeah. Thought it went really well.
All right, thanks. Anybody else? Okay, no action to take on that item. Let's move ahead to insurance claim contract change orders.
Yeah, so again, going back, August meeting, the board approved a number of contracts for our insurance claim. There are a number of change orders to approve this month, which I sort of mentioned last month. We had one. Utica has reviewed and is in agreement with the increased scope of work for all of these associated change orders. Utica is paying for this work directly, but obviously the district holds the contract, so it's our responsibility to approve the change order. Utica signs them, and also the contractor signs them. So BSI and Entrance Systems are both just related to payment bonds, so we required, working with our solicitor, after contracts were already approved, to require payment bonds. So we needed to have change orders to approve the cost of those with the contractors. Twining Construction, the high school includes the payment bond and some work that needs to be done in the FCS classroom that needs, the kitchenette needs to be replaced. And then Fort Washington includes the payment bonds and some additional flooring repairs that need to occur. So again, this is no additional cost to the district. It's all related to our insurance claim.
Comments or questions? Right, we'll move those ahead. All right, thank you. Now, item E, the FEMA approval grant, FEMA grant approval.
Yeah, so part of our storm damage, and again, we did mention this, was we had cleanup around our campuses, primarily the high school and the district office area, where debris cleanup was not on or damaging any of our buildings. And in that case, our insurance policies did not cover that cleanup. So, but it was still cleanup that we needed to move forward with. So that included like down trees, limbs that were not on or didn't cause any damage across the property. In October of last year, we were notified that FEMA had provided some or opened potential assistance for Bucks, Chester, and Montgomery counties. And part of that one of the eligible categories was debris cleanup. So we started down the path to work with FEMA to determine whether we were eligible for those funds or not. And finally, after many meetings with FEMA, a whole bunch of documentations, thank you to Mr. Lester and members of his team that went through that meeting with FEMA on site, documenting all of the cleanup, documenting GPS coordinates of cleanup. I mean, it was an extremely daunting process, but we were approved to receive a reimbursement from FEMA for the work that we did. The total cost of the debris cleanup was $41,367. We will be receiving reimbursement from FEMA for $36,367. And additionally, we're still working with FEMA on $1,818 of management costs that we will be reimbursed for potentially for the work that both Bob and myself and his team did on this project. So I think this is good news. What this approval comes down to is, in order to finalize this project with FEMA, they just told us last week that we have a form that needs to be approved, whether it's, I have my name documented on it, but it could be anyone to be an authorized agent or signer on behalf of the district. They require that before we can sign the final agreement with them. So this is the approval to basically have me as the agent to just sign the agreements with FEMA and make sure we can receive this reimbursement.
Comments or questions? Jenna?
Well, I think it goes without saying, but I'll say it. Thank you for all the work involved in that. That's great when we take advantage of funds like this that are available to us. So although I'm sure it was torturous, I think it was probably time well spent. So thank you.
Anyone else? Art?
Andy, is everything that you guys wanted to clean up around the administration building done now?
Yes, everything that was storm-related is finished.
It's finished.
Yeah, we went through, we identified any trees that were potentially in the future. We used 50% loss of the tree as a rule of thumb.
Oh, okay.
Anyone else? All right, is everybody happy to have Andy sign off on this contract? All right, so we'll move that ahead and on to the UDHS pool UV system replacement bid.
We wanted to notify the board of our intent to go out to bid to replace the UV system on the pool. It's part of our filtering system. The current system that's in there, it's old, it's obsolete. It needs to be replaced. We can't get the parts anymore to have it function on the control side. So we were looking to bid this out. It's mostly parts, very little labor. It's an expensive unit. Expecting the prices to be well over what our bid limit is. So we need to put this out.
Clarify, the current system is working, it's just old.
No, the current UV is not working at this point.
Oh, okay.
But it's only a component. It's a nice to have. It's not necessary. It does help lower the amount of chemicals, chlorine that we need to put in the pool. So it helps the effectiveness of the chlorine is really what happens.
Okay. Any other comments or questions?
The only thing I'll add to that, Mr. Schroeder, is just so we plan to go out to bid, and the timeline has us receiving bids on November 9th, so we expect to bring a recommendation back to the Finance Committee next month with the bids that are submitted.
All right. Any other comments or questions? Art?
What's the range of the cost for something like this?
We spoke with Deep Run Aquatics earlier, just to get a ballpark number, so we knew what we were looking at, because we didn't know, would it be a bid item, would it not be a bid item? We're probably in the range of $40,000 to $50,000.
Probably supply chain issues too on this.
Oh, like everything else.
And cost, yeah.
And cost. And most of it is the unit itself. We could probably, the install will be a day. Really, there's not much to it for the installation. It's more the part.
Where does it sit? Is it in the basement?
It's in the lower level where the
Low
pool
level.
filter and pool pump are.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Anyone else? Okay, we'll move that forward. All right, thank you. The natatorium dehumidification study.
Yes, so for the pool area, we have 2 dehumidification units on the roof. One of the units, the compressors have failed. We brought service out. We had some other people look at it. Cost for a repair to replace the compressors is in the area of $50,000. The cost of a new unit is around $400,000. Repairs are not a guarantee. So we contacted DJ Vervarelli Consulting Engineers, who we worked with in the past, to evaluate what's there, to give us an opinion, because the contractors all recommend a new unit, not to repair, because they can't guarantee the repairs all the time. But what we've asked for DJ Vervarelli to look into is, should we be proceeding with repairs, because we do not know what lead times are. We're hearing up to a year on lead times for certain equipment. And we know that this equipment, it's getting, with the environment that it's in, with the chlorine in the atmosphere, they don't have as long of life as other air handling units would be on a roof. So we're not at the end of life, but we're not far away from it either. So we need to make sure that, are we wasting money if we just repair this, or should we just go straight for a replacement? And they would give us an evaluation of the unit as well as part of this. They would be doing the sizing, talking to the manufacturers, what's available, what budgets are. So it also put us ahead. So if we do need to move ahead with replacement in the future, we would have that information at hand as well already.
Comments or questions? Does this have anything to do with tornado damage, with having a temporary roof on there for a while? Is this just?
No, this is just normal wear and tear.
Anyone else?
You said 400,000 roughly?
Roughly 400,000.
Wow. Significant hit. Yeah.
Yep. Was this one of the items on the facilities condition assessment?
I don't recall. No, nothing in the near future.
I don't remember seeing it there, but I didn't look until I just thought of that. All right, any other comments or questions? All right, we'll move that forward. And we're on to the Maple Glen Gymnasium roof.
Yes, the roofs at Maple Glen are now approaching 22 years old. We need to have a plan, start getting this on the capital list. for roof replacement. The gymnasium, we are experiencing more leaks. It's tougher for our roofer to find them. We're at the point where we do need to move forward. The gymnasium is the worst portion of the building. So we have a proposal from Michael Johnson, architects. Michael Johnson's the architect that helped us out with the repairs of the Fort Washington roof, the window systems at Fort Washington. He's well-versed in roofing systems. So his proposal includes some investigative work to see if there's any decking that needs to be replaced, do some looking around, make sure there's no unforeseen repairs underneath. Will give us a good idea what to expect, and also to evaluate different roofing systems for the building. It's a large shingle roof. We may be better served going to a metal roof. So he would, as part of his study, he would give us all the proposals, what would be his recommendations, cost evaluations, and also the second phase of his proposal, once we do decide if we could to go out to bid for replacement, whatever we decide, it would be his design and construction management services are also in this proposal.
Comments or questions?
And I'll just add one other thing here is that, back to your point, if you ask the question again, the Maple Glen roof is on our facility condition assessment. I think it was a couple years out. As Bob mentioned, the roof over the gym is in need of review now. The rest of the roof, I think, can wait till it's on the timeline of the facility condition assessment.
Yes, the other roof is holding up well, but this will get us a start because it is such a big building. That the roof replacement will take time to occur. So doing it in phases. And the way the building is designed, doing it in phases works perfectly.
Right, the gymnasium roof is a completely independent roof system, as I recall, on that
Yes,
building
it is.
from the rest of it. Teacher.
Yeah, so if we know that it's leaking and we know that needs replacement, do you need these services?
Yes, these are the services to evaluate the bid documents, come up with what type of roof should we be putting on, what would be best for the district. It would also be all the drawings that are needed, permit drawings that we would need are all included. And it would be the management services as well, evaluating the bids, being on site during the changeover of the roof, the repairs to the roof. He would actually be on site doing inspections of the work.
Art?
Yeah, I think Maple Glen opened in 2000, so it's 22 years now, and we've been having problems with, especially the gym roof, for a number of years. So I really strongly recommend that we move forward with this and try to deal with that. We had some problems too around the roof, around the windows in Maple Glen that we dealt with. Matt?
Yes, several years ago, we were experiencing more leaks. We changed roofers. We brought in somebody who's more experienced in shingled roofs and peaked roofs. And we found the source of the problem back then was a lot of nails were starting to pop. And that was about the 15-year mark of the roof. And that's typically when you start to see nails coming through the shingles. So we did a lot of repairs that solved a lot of those issues. And the way it's designed that no matter where it's leaking on the roof, it tends to wind up dripping out near the windows. It's just how the decking system was designed for that building.
Other comments or questions? All right, we'll move that forward. Thank you. On to the regular monthly financials.
Yes, there's not a ton to cover this month. Everything is trending very much as we expected to. So you can see total receipts are in line with the prior year, 72% received as compared to last year, 72%. The one thing of note, again, we mentioned it last month, but you can see interest income. We've received already year to date about $210,000 of interest income compared to our budget of $75,000. And again, that is when we approved our budget, there really was no upward movement in interest rates or had just begun. We've seen since March of 2022, the target rate increase from 0.25% up to right now, it's a range of 3 to 3.25%. We also, if you're love paying attention to the Fed like I do, there's talk of it going up even into the 4.5% range. So we certainly expect that to continue to trend in our benefit. And again, another reason why we're at a good place now of having solid cash balances that we're earning interest income off of, which is a good thing. And you can see on the expense side for the general fund, prior year 15%, or 14%. Current year, we're at 15% year-to-date. Again, this is through September. July and August are very low expense months. September is really the first significant month of expenses we see. So everything is trending right where we would expect it to be. There is not much to mention on the other financial reports. Like I said, everything's right in line, so I don't want to spend a ton of time there tonight as we have a lot to cover, but I will certainly answer any questions if there are specific questions about items in any of those reports.
All right, any comments or questions on anything in the monthly financials? Art?
Just to comment quickly, the two-year treasury today was the highest it's been since 2008, and it's going to continue to go up. So keep investing in short. And I noticed what we're doing now, and I think, there's lots of, so many better options now in terms of where we're going to invest the money. And again, Andy, you were a genius, and when we floated the bonds, I think Mark mentioned this the other day, too, last couple of months ago, that we went out with the financing for Sandy Run. It's a perfect time. Districts that are now looking to finance are going to have significant issues.
Thank you, but if I was that much of a genius,
you wouldn't be here.
I'd have a couple million in the bank. So thank you.
I think my comment was, we didn't try to time the market,
$1
but,
million.
but as it worked out. Yeah, and it is great. You can see in the interest rates significantly climbing. We still have a couple of older CDs that are going to mature soon that are still paying pretty much nothing, but everything else is really, really growing well. So yeah, nice job on finding those. All right, and was there anything else on monthly financials? Okay, we'll move those forward. Budgetary transfers, anything to say there?
Nothing to say on the transfers specifically. I just like to mention the first time we see this. So budgetary transfers by school code cannot begin until October 1st, basically. So that's why we're just seeing them for the first time this month. I like to mention that budgetary transfers, when we create a budget, we create it with the best knowledge we have. When we create it based on trends, facts, information that's available to us, things don't happen exactly as planned. That's what the budget transfer process is for. As we move through the years, we recognize different needs. And at the end of the day, what we don't, just for everyone to understand, what we don't use the budgetary transfer process for is to spend down funds that we don't need in our budget. We use it to take care of what we need in order to operate and make sure buildings, staff, teachers have what they need to educate our students.
Comments or questions? Okay, we'll approve those. Okay. And now we get the exciting part of kicking off the budget.
Yeah, so we kicked off the budget a little bit last month. We talked about the timeline. And last month, the reason I bring the timeline back here, again, still in draft form, but last month we talked about the Act 1 index, which lays out the timeline that school districts must follow in order to go through the budget process. It actually was not available last month, which was a bit unusual. I think it was the day after we had our board meeting, the Act 1 timeline actually came out. So I updated the timeline with all of our required steps and the dates that we need to follow in order to go through the process. So really the major thing that we need to be focused on right now in this early part of the budget process is that by January 26, 2023 is when we have to either have approved an opt-out resolution, which basically says that we are going to not increase taxes as a board beyond the Act 1 index, which is 4.1%. Last month that was estimated. This month that is finalized at 4.1%, or go through the full formal preliminary budget process and approve for referendum exceptions that go beyond the Act 1 index. So January 26 is our guide. By our timeline, tonight we'll be going through a couple things. This timeline, we'll talk about a first look of the 23-24 budget, specifically from the assumptions that we're going to use to build the budget. And then we'll talk about briefly the results from last year and a recommendation for the surplus from last year. So that's what we're looking at from a timeline perspective. I would think we'd be in a position by November next month to approve the opt-out resolution if that's the path the board desires to go down, and then by December to approve a preliminary budget if that's the path the board would want to go down. So next month we'll actually go through a much more detailed review of the preliminary budget. So questions on the timeline?
All right, let's jump into the assumptions.
Ms. Evans, you'll pull that up. Thank you. Okay, so where we start the budget every year is just to go through and for me to give you an update of this part of the budget process. We call this the first look. This is not the preliminary budget. This is just talking about as we build out our budget, what assumptions, what major assumptions are we using to build our budget this year? So that's what I'm going to go through to start. I'll take questions and then we'll talk about the 21-22 final results.
Can I just interrupt briefly,
Certainly.
Andy, just to clarify for everyone, this slide deck is the same information as the document that is attached to the agenda.
That is absolutely
Just in a
correct.
different
So
format.
this is just a different way for me to kind of walk through it. The document that was included includes all of this same information. This was just an easier way to kind of show it and present it. So as far as general assumptions, there are a number of basic general assumptions that we've used as we've created the budget over the last couple of years, right? When we look at enrollment, we're assuming flat enrollment, which I think is fair when you look at, we had a demographic study that really showed our enrollment not changing much over the next 5 years. Staffing levels, we use status quo to our budget. So we say we're not anticipating any new staff, we're not assuming any reduction, it's status quo to start from. We use the 22-23 salary and benefits as the base for contract and rate increases. We will continue to utilize a needs-based budget philosophy, whereas we don't just start with a budget and add a percentage to it. Every year we work with our budget owners. We work with them. They go through and define what the needs of their department and building are each year, and then we review that to ultimately get to a final budget. We are assuming no changes to our committed fund balances, which we will talk about a little more. And from a budgetary reserve, it remains at $700,000, which is budgetary reserve is for true unknowns, $250,000 for general unknowns, $200,000 for special education contingency, and $250,000 for unknown assessment appeals that may come up. So when we look at real estate taxes, historically, what this chart shows you is that orange line is the Act 1 index, orange line are actual increases, blue line is the Act 1 index, and over the last 6 years, the final tax increase has been below the Act 1 index, and it also represents 6 of the 7 lowest property tax increases since 2006, 2007. 23, 24, and beyond, we're using a 2% as a property tax increase as a placeholder only. Again, that's just what we talk about. That's a conservative number that we can keep in our budget as projections. At this point, we are still just using the projected amount in our forecast. So when we look at other local revenue assumptions, so property taxes are our primary source of revenue for the district, which makes up about 73%. The long-term projection, as I said, is a 2% increase. The Act 1 index, as I also mentioned, was 4.1%. So the projection is significantly below where the index is. And I think what you should, the Act 1 index is projected to stay at that elevated 3.5% to 4% range, actually, as noted by the IFO over the next couple of years. No expected revenue from new developments is built into our current forecast, except for revenues and assessments that we already receive. So we're not projecting how we'll receive revenue from new developments, but we do know that's out there. We are also not projecting in here any significant decreases from assessment appeals, and we know that we've got 6 of our top 10 taxpayers that we have open assessment appeals on, which will likely result in significant loss of revenue as well. So we don't have either side of that built into the current early look of the budget. Also, we have the property tax rebate that the board has supported at 100%. We have a $100,000 reduction for that, which was what we built into the final budget last year. Earned income tax is trending right in line with where we would expect. So we're using a 1% increase right now, which seems to be a very conservative number with what we've been seeing. So we'll continue to adjust that throughout the year. Interim taxes, the same thing. We have no change there. Delinquent taxes, no change. Transfer taxes, no change. Transfer taxes, if you notice from the report, has actually stayed fairly consistent. I thought we would see a slowdown in property transactions with the rising interest rates. We may still see that, but right now I'm very comfortable with where the budget is at in this early look. Investment income was increased to $500,000, which is probably still a very conservative number at this early point. I just didn't want to leave it at $75,000. That represents about a 1% earnings rate on historical end-of-month balances. So we know we're earning closer to 3% right now. We'll continue to adjust that throughout the year. But if you think on 1% earnings on historical balances is about $500,000 annually. When we look at state and federal revenues, so state revenues represent about 18% of the district budget. I continue to take the stance that we'll use current year budget or project next year. So obviously the state goes through their budget process every year. We actually had a nice pickup in the 22-23 year compared to our budget. So the state budget was not approved until a month after the district had to approve their budget. So there's a $450,000 increase from the current year budget to the current projection, again, matching our current year budget. A question that typically comes up is, isn't that number the lowest you can receive? And again, remember, there's 2 pieces to basic ed and special ed funding right now with the state. One is what you call hold harmless. It doesn't change. There's another piece to that formula, which is run through a formula. And our numbers, along with every other district, can trend up or down based on how our data that calculate that formula change in relation to every other district. So my recommendation will continue to be, we'll leave it flat, especially since it's a low percentage of our budget until we understand what the state's final budget is. And then federal revenues are extremely small, but we continue to see federal revenues trend downward other than new revenues like ESSER, which will be one time. So we use a 10% reduction each year because that's what we've been seeing. And then as far as ESSER dollars go, at this preliminary look of the budget, no ESSER dollars are built in. When we build in ESSER dollars, it'll be a wash to the budget because we'll build in the revenues and the expenses, which will fully offset each other. On salaries and benefits, so salary increases are based on current bargaining agreements and status, as I mentioned, status quo for the number of staff. Health benefits, we use a standard, and I also note there that under wages, UDEA, the current contract is through the end of this year. UDSD is through 2027. So again, UDSD, we use the current calculation for what those increases would be under the contract. And then for UDEA, we use what we would typically use for any other projection where it's not a contract year. We put a flat 3% in as just a projection out into the future. So that's what's in the budget currently. Workers' compensation is a $41,000 increase, which will likely come down to 0 by the end of the year. Again, workers' compensation, we have rebates and discounts that we receive every year. They're not built in until the final rates are set in the December-January timeframe. This chart just gives you a sense of PSERS, and again, I think we all know PSERS, the state pension system. This actually extends out much further than what I've shown in the past, so I actually have the full rate projections in here for PSERS, and you can see that over the next, through mid-2030s, the rates just continue to trend up. And then finally, you see a large drop off. And what that is, that's the state's projections. They go through actuarial evaluations, and the rates are getting the fund or the system to be fully funded. And that's where you see when it becomes fully funded, there's significant drop-offs down to much lower rates. But this is where you can see kind of that rate stays very consistent for the next 12 to 13 years. Other expenses, you can see here, charter school tuition, we do have a reduction of $133,000. And again, this is where we'll go through the needs-based budget in all these other expense categories, but these are some things that we did make changes to in this early look of the budget. We do have an enrollment reduction in charter schools, so we will continue to adjust that with enrollment throughout the year. Debt service is now stabilized as we have no immediate planned borrowings, so there was nothing to forecast in there, whereas the last few years we've seen increases from Sandy Run, the final borrowings for Sandy Run. And this last one, the transfer to the capital reserve. So we started talking about this as a committee and a board last year, is the need to really start to build something into our budget for a planned transfer to the capital reserve. We've had some over the last 2 years, but what this really gets to now, I built in kind of a placeholder $3 million in the early look here. And what $3 million represents, if you remember back when ICS presented the facility condition assessment, they talked about the APPA and the recommendation of having 1.5% to 3% of the total value of your facilities set aside each year. I took a conservative number there and said, okay, 1.5%. Let's start with 1% and go from there. So the value of our facilities is roughly $300 million. So $3 million represents $1 million or 1% transfer to the capital reserve. So that's what's placeholder in our budget right now. This just shows you our major budget increases as you look. So if you look, wages, based on all of the information I shared with you, is increasing by a little over 1.75 million. Medical and prescription, about 745,000. PSERS and FICA is 979,000, charter school reduction. And then the transfer to capital reserve, again, 2.4 represents the increase over our current year budget. We have 585,000 and change budgeted this year, 3 million next year, so that's the increase. So we're looking at about $5.76 million of increased expenditures. And the whole piece around the unassigned fund balance, I will touch on that in a little bit. So then we get into the last, which is our 5-year projection model. And you can see in the document in the packet, or that's attached, is our 5-year model really gets into looking at, Brooke left, click on that. So if you click on that link, if you're in the actual document, that really gets to now the assumptions and saying, if you look at our current budget, revenues are actually projected to be slightly ahead of expenses without the transfer. And then when we look at the need to potentially make a transfer to the capital reserve, the placeholder of $3 million, our deficit for 23-24, mine's not opening up here. It's 2.775 million is the deficit again, but that's with a transfer to the capital reserve of $3 million. So things, I think our financial position is very stable. It's strong. We are in a much better position than we've been in even last year when we started talking about the preliminary budget. But what I want to make sure we focus on is not just 23, 24. I continue to talk about protecting the future, right? So when we look out 5 years on this projection model, the forecast is to have about a $4.8 million deficit as we look out to the 27, 28 years. So while we are in a very stable, strong position right now financially, we need to continually focus on decisions we make today and how they're going to affect us for 1 to 5 years to come. So that's an important note here. unassigned fund balance, based on the end-of-year projections, is projected to be 10.3%. And then we'll talk about the capital reserve transfer from last year. And one of the things we talked about last year was looking at taking the entire end-of-year surplus and transferring it to our capital reserve. We had a motion at the end of the year to do that because we know we have not only the facility needs right in front of us that are on our facility condition assessment, but we have other things come up like the pool items that we talked about tonight, the UV system, and the items on the roof. We're going to have these come up, and the more cash we can set aside for that now, the better position we'll be, the less money we may need to borrow in the future as we're planning today for our current and future needs. So I'll talk more about kind of the unassigned fund balance and the transfer to capital reserve. That's the next item we'll get to. But I'll stop there and just see if there's any questions about the assumptions that we're using in creating the early look and the preliminary version of our budget for next year.
All right, any comments or questions on budget assumptions?
Andy, the medical, that is a group setup. Do you expect any changes in the number of members in the group, number of districts? Because those numbers seem to make a difference, right?
You mean in the consortium as a
Yes,
whole?
yeah,
Do we
yeah,
expect
yeah.
any? Well, we are not at this point hearing of any districts that are talking about leaving the consortium.
Because that's been, for a while, there was some movement, but you're saying you have the feeling that it's rather stable at the moment.
I certainly can't speak for other districts. We're not aware that any districts are leaving. Before, I think it was the year before I started with the district, there were a number of districts that did leave the consortium. Since that time, it's been stable. I don't believe anyone else has left the consortium, and we're not hearing of anyone
And
that's
nobody's joining
considering leaving. Nobody has joined the consortium in that time either.
Okay, all right.
Anyone else? Jenna?
So I know there's still plenty of time to talk about all of this. I might, just to plant a seed, I may nudge a little bit on some of the assumptions, just for things like earned income tax, and real estate transfer tax, where we've been kind of wildly outperforming budget. Now, those are so hard to budget for, so I get that, but I know you said we'll look at 5-year averages. Just some of those sound a little low to me, again, just based on what happened the last 2 years anyway. So again, plenty of time to talk about it, but I may just nudge a little bit on that.
Darlene?
Another assumption I'd just like us to keep in mind, the APPA recommends investment in capital renewal funding of 1.5 to 3%. And I know, you're going in right now at 1%. But again, keeping in mind everything that needs to be done in our school district and the things that are unknown at this point, I'd like just really keep an eye on that, because I think when someone makes a recommendation, I think we should get as close to that recommendation as possible and not come in under it.
On that topic, 2 thoughts on that topic. I think it's critically important, as I said at the end of the budget season last year, that we do plan to transfer money every year to capital reserve, a planned transfer. We have had transfers to capital reserve, as we see in the big table there, many years, that comes typically out of end-of-year surplus. And we typically will have an end-of-year surplus because we budget conservatively. And so if we budget at 1%, there's a good chance that we'll end up at more than 1% just through end-of-year surplus. So I'm comfortable with being under the recommendation for the plan transfer on the assumption that the plan transfer is not always going to be all of it. But I am curious, when we say 1% of our total asset value, how are we calculating total asset value?
Yeah, I use we go through a process with our insurance every year, and we have a value based on our insurance, our insured value, so that's the value I'm using. So we have $300 million in insured value for our facilities.
Okay, yeah, that sounds like a reasonable source. Also on interest income, so Jenna talked about earned income tax and property tax revenue being historically overperforming budget. Interest income, I think, before COVID was $750K, and that was at a time when interest rates were lower than they are now. So even $500K seems rather safe to me at this point. But it is early. We have plenty of time to narrow that down. But I would anticipate, I would expect that to rise over time. Any other comments on any of these assumptions? All right, no action to take. Shall we move on to the transfer item?
Yeah, so the transfer item, so at this point, we're still working on finalizing our audit, but we're at a point where both Ms. Baldessano and I feel comfortable with the number that we're going to discuss tonight being relatively close to the number we're going to end up at. Our auditors agree with us with where we're at. So everything's been going, I think, very smoothly with the audit. So I'll just say that first and foremost, and that's thanks again to Ms. Baldessano and the work her and our business office staff do. So it was another relatively quiet and successful audit this year, even though we're still working through it. It is also likely, I will just mention, that expenses and revenues will go up significantly without having an overall change in the end-of-year surplus. And that is because when we initially talked to our auditors about guidance for, and I believe I even mentioned this at a finance committee meeting, about our insurance proceeds and the expenses for all of our insurance work, our auditors initially guided us to net those out so it did not have a material impact to our expenses and revenues. After they came in and reviewed, they actually changed their opinion on that, and they will likely recommend journal entries to get that all back in revenue and expense buckets. So again, it's netted to zero now. When we make these entries, if that's what they recommend, it'll still net to zero because we'll show an exact amount of revenue as we will expense. But the expense and revenue numbers could change, but our bottom line end-of-year surplus will not change as a result of those entries. We are currently estimating right now that we'll close the year with a surplus of about $5.5 million, which we did anticipate in our year-end projections when we started planning for the end of the year. And in June, the board approved 3 motions, knowing that we would likely end the year with a significant surplus. One was to make a committed transfer. We took $1 million from our unassigned fund balance and committed it. And then we also said we're going to make motions to be able to take the end of year surplus and either commit additional dollars to real estate assessment or healthcare stabilization, or transfer the surplus to our capital reserve fund. So the board ultimately has the option of moving all or just a portion of that $5.5 million of surplus to just one or across all 3 of those options. My recommendation, as I sort of laid out at the end of last year, continues to be that we transfer the surplus to capital reserve. And I make that recommendation again for a number of reasons. I feel our committed fund balances are sufficient at the moment. So our healthcare stabilization committed fund balance, along with the balance that we have in the healthcare consortium, currently amounts to about 6 months worth of premium that we have available, which is a sufficient amount in that category, in my opinion. We have real estate assessments set aside for $2.5 million, which I feel is sufficient. Again, we do have some large assessments from property owners. We also do have district appeals that are open, and we have new developments. So I feel like that's sufficient. Capital projects, current and anticipated, would utilize basically our entire balance of $21.6 million. Now, again, I want to be clear, that $21.6 million is the $15 million that we have in our capital reserve specifically, along with the $5+ million that we set aside from our final borrowing last year to help pay for the Fort Washington Giza project that we have. So when you put those both together, it's about $21.5 million. Not included in those estimates are the Maple Glen roof that we talked about tonight. So you can see I kind of have a placeholder in the document there for the roof, and the UV system that we talked about. So retaining any amount in retaining any amount in our unassigned balance could leave the district with an amount that is not in compliance with our board policy 620. So certainly another option is just to do nothing with it, which would leave our unassigned fund balance at a larger than needed balance and outside of compliance with policy. So beyond budgeted amounts, year-end surplus is the only other method to funding our capital reserve. So we can either plan for it in our budget, or we can take surplus and transfer to capital reserve. We don't really have the opportunity, the board doesn't have an opportunity to transfer the capital reserve for any other reason. So this kind of is our one time, besides what we budgeted, to transfer to capital reserve. So my recommendation, again, it's open to discussion, and we don't need to make a final decision tonight. I should have said that up front. What I'm looking for tonight is guidance on what the Finance Committee really wants us to work with our auditors to get into our final financial statements. So then once they're finalized, we can bring the final motions back to the Finance Committee and ultimately approved by the board on how you want to allocate that $5.5 million surplus. Again, my recommendation remains to transfer it to the Capital Reserve Fund.
Comments or questions? Jenna?
So I think that's a very good recommendation. You know, things like we just heard today, we could have unexpected costs in addition to the ones that we already know about. So I'm definitely committed to increasing that capital reserve. So to me, that's a wise recommendation.
Yeah, I'm on board too. I think transferring the full balance to capital reserve is the right thing to do. I agree that our committed fund balances are okay. Another option we could enumerate is we could commit for some other purpose if we chose to, but I don't know that we have another purpose to commit for. Transferring the full amount to capital reserve, I think, is the right plan as well. I'll say, and I'm speaking for myself here, my hope is that we can fund pretty much the entire next 10 years of capital projects as outlined in the facility condition assessment through this process rather than by borrowing. And in order to achieve that, and that in addition to paying for buses and unforeseen capital projects, et cetera, in order to facilitate that, we need to be aggressively committing money to capital reserve. So this is a larger than expected surplus this year, which is, a nice problem to have. We don't necessarily take pride in having such a large surplus, but because we have it, let's do the wise thing with it and set money aside. Art.
And obviously, once we transfer money into the capital reserve, we cannot transfer it out. Just to clarify that. Does the same case hold for the other two pots? When you put it into property taxes assessment, can you transfer it?
So committed fund balances are more money is added or you can remove based on board approval. So the board does have authority to increase or reduce committed fund balances. I agree with you, transfers to the capital reserve are one-way trips, right. But the one flexibility that you do have there, should you ever need it, I would only ever use it as a last case scenario, is you could pay debt service out of the capital reserve fund. So the board does have flexibility where debt service is accounted for in our general fund
Right.
budget. If you ever needed to, you could make debt service payments.
You stated that somewhere in here. And we don't talk too often about the money sitting in debt service? Is it about 5 million?
It's about it's a little over 5 million.
I think we like it to sit in there because when we do go out to get our bond ratings, they like to see those kinds of balances. But for debt service, I mean, but we still have that in case there's a real concern. Can we transfer from debt service to capital?
No, it's a one-way trip into the debt service.
Into debt
fund.
service and capital?
Correct.
Okay, yeah, I agree, and it's really great to see that we have the 5.5. I think our goal is to not borrow anymore, not increase our debt service. You know, we've heard from the community about, you know, what our debt service is, and I know it is going down. There will be, when the electoral debt goes away, that will significantly reduce our debt service. But, you know, anything we can do to avoid going out with additional bonds. My last question on this topic is how would we fund the bus garage?
So that is something we would absolutely have to figure out, if it's if we pay for it
Yeah,
with cash
because
or if we borrow. I mean, my only difference there, and again, I don't want to make exceptions, I'm just saying, as we consider the funding options, if we move down that path, is we currently lease a facility. So if we borrowed for a bus